So in this video, I'll be talking through how I created my low poly floating island. So I started by making my island. I went into Mesh Tools, then selected Create Polygon, and drew the outline of my island. Then I added height to my island by using the Extrude tool in the modeling toolkit. I then used the scale tool to bring the bottom of my island in, creating a more pointed look at the bottom. To give the top of my island a ridge, I used the extrude tool again, giving the top of my island an offset and then dragging the top up. To create more of a texture for my island, I remeshed it, retopologized it, went into vertex mode, selected the entire bottom half of my island. I transformed that, went into mesh display harden edges. I went into mesh reduce, and I made the finishing changes by editing in vertex mode. Next, I created some color presets for the island. I then went into face mode and started selecting parts of the island, then assigning them to those assets. To further the rocky and rough feel of my island, I chose two base colors, like two colors for the base, and then two grass colors, so making use of all four colors. Okay, next I made my trees. So first I placed a cylinder, then I changed the subdivision axis to get a more rough look for the cylinder. I then scaled in the top using face mode and selecting the top faces and scaling them in. I did this to get my tree trunk. Then I duplicated the cylinder, and this was now the first section of my tree. I placed it on top of the trunk and scaled the top in even more to create a much more pointed look for this section. I did this to create all sections of my tree, editing each section to give it an original look. Next, I chose some colors for my tree. I selected two colors for the green part, making my trees look more interesting, and then I chose one color for my trunk. I then assigned the different parts of my tree to these attributes. Next, I selected the entire tree and duplicated it, creating and placing a second tree. I proceeded to do this until I had many trees distributed on my island, editing each one individually for them to still look different. Next, I made my pine cones. So I added a cylinder. I scaled it down to be much shorter. I then extruded the sides of my cylinder by selecting all the faces along its side and then selecting extrude face and dragging it out. I then scaled the extruded parts down, making them thinner than the base. I then selected a section of 3 in face mode, selected extrude face and extruded these 3 sections outwards, scaling the end of this extrude in to make it thinner. I then moved this section up at the end using my move tool. I then extruded this yet again, this time scaling the end out to make it thicker. I also scaled it up, making it thicker in both directions. I then beveled the edge of the outside of this section by going into edge mode, selecting the correct edges and beveling them, adjusting the sharpness. In vertex mode, I then just brought the bottom of this section down, creating the look of a single section of a pine cone. Then I went into face mode and deleted all the parts of my shape that I don't need, leaving only 3 sections. I just shaped leaving only the 3 sections I just shaped and the 3 sections next to it. I then went into my rotate tool, went into my modeling toolkit and changed my step snap to absolute. Then changed the value next to that to 20, aka how many faces I had at the top of my shape at the start. I then duplicated the shape I had and rotated the duplicated part out from my original shape. I then pressed Shift D to duplicate and transform. This made a full bottom part for my pine cone. I then selected everything and merged them. I then went into face mode and deleted all the sections in the very middle of my shape. Then I duplicated my shape, moving the duplicated shape up and stacking it on top of my original shape and rotating it so the pine needles wouldn't line up with each other. I repeated this step multiple times, stacking until I had created a full pine cone. I then combined all the individual shapes again. I then went into edge mode, selected all the edges at the top which now had a big hole between them, and clicked the fill hole. I did the same at the bottom. Next, I gave my shape a lattice and set the correct divisions. I then selected my lattice points, selected the lattice points on the inside of my shape, and moved this section down with my move tool. I then selected this top section of my pine cone with the lattice and scaled it in. I next used the soft modification tool to move the end of my pine cone needles around individually, giving the pine cone an even more random look. I then selected my pine cone and selected smooth. Next, I chose a color for my pine cones and then assigned this color to it. I then duplicated my pine cone, scaling each duplicate to a different size to make them all look unique. I then placed my pine cones all over my trees and the ground of my island. Next, I created my river. I went into vertex mode. I chose the paint selection tool. Then I drew out what shape I would like my river to be on my island. I then went into my move tool, which enabled me to move the selected part down, creating a path for my river. Next, I added a new plane to the scene. I made it the right size to fit onto my island, into the dip I had just created for my river. I made the subdivision's height and width much higher. Then I deformed this by selecting texture, then choosing the ocean texture. I edited this texture until I was happy with the look of my river. I then clicked on CV curve tool and drew out the line for my river on my island. I then selected my river, selected the curve, and clicked on curve warp to attach them to each other. I then positioned my river to lay perfectly on my island and created the water flowing off of the island effect by using vertex mode and editing the curve. I then chose and assigned a color to my river. Lastly, I created the boulders. So I added a platonic solid shape to my scene. I edited the shape of it using vertex mode. Then I chose and assigned a color to my boulder. Next, I duplicated it multiple times, changing the size of each boulder. And I then just placed the boulders all around my island. And that's how I created my low poly floating island.